Welcome everyone to the post-lunch session. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker, Professor Ganesh Viswanathan, who's a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, IIT Bombay. Ganesh has a background in chemical engineering. He did his master's from IISc, then went on to do a PhD at University of Houston. And then he worked in systems biology during his postdoc, working at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, which has many of the leaders in the field of systems biology as we know it today, and then moved on to IIT Bombay. I must thank Ganesh especially because it was a school that he had organized in April 2012, in which I participated as a student, as a master student then, and got to learn various different aspects of systems biology. And then, of course, that solidified my interest in this. And the other speaker for the day, Professor Sandeep Kar, him also I met when I was a master student in a conference in 2011. So these conferences that you have, I'm just a message for students, you never know what impact it can have in the long-term life. So just keep that in mind. You may not realize what you're gaining over 2 weeks, but you may realize over a decade later what impact such conferences and community building events can have. Without any further ado, over to Ganesh.
Okay, thanks Mohit and Shaon for inviting me and especially accommodating my request for only this specific day on which I'll actually give my talk, given my other constraints. And of course, thanks for remembering the SERC school that we organized back in 2012. I'm glad to note that it has had some impact on you. So I'm going to do chalk and board for the first part. So what I have planned is I'll give a glimpse of the Boolean modeling that I'll be talking about as part of the research talk. This cuts across little graph theory, and I understand that it's a little heterogeneous crowd here. And of course, I'm going to talk about heterogeneity in biological systems and how Boolean modeling would actually fit into capturing the heterogeneities in a certain way. Everything in these kind of aspects starts with network, and it's very important to understand how to build a network. So we'll start from that, and then we'll move on to how to associate Boolean modeling to it and where it falls into place in terms of quantitation of network dynamics. So the networks can generally be looked at as simply a set of entities and connections between them. And the entities and connections can, depending upon the context, one can see it in many, many different ways. So for instance, if I want to write a kinetic model, then the detailed biochemistry, which is associated with the interaction between the entities, they play a very, very crucial role. Whereas if I look at a broader sense of looking at how the interactions are happening, then the biochemistry does not play that much of a role, and we'll actually see how biochemistry can actually be wired into these kind of models. So at one level, you have to get into the details of the biochemistry while dictating or defining the edges that connect different nodes in the network. The nodes could be proteins, it could be connections with the DNA, it could just be an mRNA and whatnot, okay? Whereas if you look at broader level features, what is primarily of interest is the nature of interactions between them and not really the biochemical details. So, of course, biochemistry plays a role in defining how to cull out the interactions between different nodes in a given network. So, for example, the nature of interaction could be a simple activation. It could be an enzymatic reaction. The biochemistry would actually dictate the nature of the interaction. So once we understand the biochemistry, we can actually put down the nature of interaction. And a simple example could be that if you have a node A, which actually, and you have another node B or entity, then it could simply be an activation. A is simply activating B. And note that the direction, there is a direction associated, and there is also a sign associated with that. Or it could simply be a simple inhibition, where there is a negative influence of A on B, which generally we represent by using this symbol called hammers. You can also have a third entity which will actually play a role in terms of regulating the interaction between A and B. Again, it could be a negative influence or a positive influence depending upon the nature of the entity, and that influence is decided by the biochemistry. So clearly you can see that defining the interactions actually is dictated by the biochemistry associated with it. And if the biochemistry is not there, the entire network biology is a no-starter. So when we build a network, one of the important things is we have to be very, very clear about if the biochemistry is very well known for a given interaction. And if it's not well known, that must be factored in while actually accounting for in the network modeling. So these three are the key important aspects in building a network. And once we know this, how many entities you want to add, how many interactions you want to add, everything falls under the window of modeling assumption. How much coarse-grained network you want, what are the kind of questions you ask, that would dictate what kind of network you actually want to build. Yes, see, when it comes to modeling of different types, the nature of functional form would actually be become important in terms of the approximations that you make. For example, if you want to look at the nuts and bolts of looking at the kinetic model, then obviously you need to know the exact functional form. But suppose if you're looking at a broader level model, which is what I'm going to discuss, the actual functional form actually do not play a role. Or you're kind of cheating the system in the sense of ignoring the actual functional form of the model. So the functional form would just completely depend upon what is the level to which you want to use your modeling approach. Okay, so once we have these networks in place, the classical kinetic model are not scalable in terms of the size of the network. So typically any system could have networks which can run into few tens to a few hundreds, and it's not possible to account for all of these in the classical kinetic modeling framework. So which is where the Boolean modeling framework actually comes into play. And a broader class of Boolean modeling is what is called as discrete modeling technique. And much of the work in this area has been done by a lot of pioneering work by Rekha Albert from Penn State. In fact, there are several tutorial type papers, which is a good starter to get into this modeling area. And so I'm also going to discuss some of the examples given by Rekha Albert as a motivating example. So what I'm going to specifically look at is the Boolean modeling framework, where for every node, we assume that it's either active or inactive. It's a simple 0-1 state, okay? In a discrete modeling, a generalized discrete modeling approach, you can have multiple values for a given state. So if I have node A, the node A can actually be an on state or an off state. These are the only two possible states of a value that a given node can actually take in a Boolean modeling approach. And I can assign 0 for on, 1 for off. I can do vice versa. I can set 1 for on and 0 for off. I have a choice. As long as you decide a priori what choice you're going to make, you have to be consistent in the way you actually write the entire model. So once we do this, we can actually set up the entire Boolean modeling by defining functions for the dynamic variables, which is essentially the Boolean value taken by each of the nodes in the network. So we have to define Boolean functions. So I specifically want to highlight this every node here. So when we implement Boolean modeling for biological networks, so far I didn't talk about how to implement it in biological networks. So when we implement it in biological networks, whether you want to assign function to every node or not depends upon the nature of the node. And we'll talk about it a little bit in a short while. So in order to define this function, I'll start with a specific motivating example, which is taken from Rekha Albert's work. And with that, we'll build the entire framework. It's a very simple toy network. There are 3 nodes here. And of course, these interactions have been taken for a specific purpose to demonstrate a specific thing about this modeling approach. Now, A is activating B, so which means that if A is present, then in the immediate time step, so note that we're going to have a time notion that's going to come in here. So we start with a specific 0-1 combination for these nodes in the network. And then as we progress in time, we essentially use these interactions to update the values of the nodes with time. And that process is what is called as an update step. So let's write the Boolean function for this. So if I take A star will be the value of that value taken by that node in the next time step. So that would essentially be dictated by this function here. So you have a hammer going from C to A, which means when C is absent, A will be actually activated. So essentially, which means that I can write truth table for every interaction which is actually present. And a good practice is actually to write the truth table for every interaction before we conduct the simulations. So it's a good practice to do that. Write truth table for every tiny bit of interaction which is actually present in the network. And similarly, I can write B as NC and C star. Okay. Now, I have a choice here. So note that I have used an AND logic here. I can, of course, use OR logic as well. So I have a choice as to how I want to use my logic here. And this is one more place where biochemistry will actually play a role. So we have to understand what is the nature of activation that's happening in the real system as reported by the experimentalist or experimental observations. And based on that, I have to decide what is the logic that I have to use when multiple interactions are actually pointing to a given node. So therefore, there are 3 aspects that we have considered here. One is, you can see, we've considered direction of the interaction. We've considered sign of the interaction. And we also have considered the logic associated with the interactions affecting a given node. So these 3 aspects of the interaction actually are necessary to write a Boolean model. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yes. 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 Yeah. So yes. So you have to. You may not be able to find the logic for all the cases. So in which case you will have to make some approximation or modeling assumption. Now there are ways to assess the sensitivity of these logics that you're assuming. We'll talk about random model mostly in the second half of the talk a little bit, where you can actually use a randomized model to assess the sensitivity of these things. But yes, it's not possible to know everything, but if you do not know, yes, you can make an educated assumption. Yes. Yeah, that would still fall into biochemistry, right? The data comes from experiments anyway, right? So when I say biochemistry, you are expected to look at the data and decipher what is the biochemistry. Yes. One-to-one is very difficult to comment on because the expression profiles can be dynamic in nature. Now you see, I have not introduced the dynamism into the logic that I'm assigning here, right? So yes, from data you can extract the logic, but whether it is one-to-one, hard to tell. Okay? No, so see, gene expression is not equal to the expression of the protein levels. We all know this, right? So gene expression is at best indicative. If you have the protein expressions, the activity of the binding, that's the best, which will allow you to decide what's the logic you should use. But that's not possible for all the cases. So in absence of this, of course, gene expression can help. Okay, so what I've done is essentially written down the Boolean functions for the activation of 3 nodes. And once I have the Boolean function, I'm all set for doing the Boolean simulations. So if I now define a vector, x as a function of time, and this is essentially the values A star, B star, and C star. If I define a vector, okay, so I would prefer a row vector other than a column. So if I define it as there are some advantages we'll see in defining it as a row vector. So if I now define the values taken by this as a vector, then I'm essentially want to understand how x at t plus 1 will look like. And once I understand this, I can move forward and then I can estimate the Boolean values for the entire network till I reach a steady state. Okay. So the way to do this is, I'm essentially going to evaluate these functions by assuming values taken at the previous time step. And using those values, I'm going to use these functions to find out what is the current value at t plus 1. So if I now start, let's say at x equal to 0, okay, suppose let's say I start with 0, 0, 1. This is my current start state, okay. What will be x1? Can we read it out? So A star is not of C, right? So this will be 0. And what will be B? A and C, right? So this will be 0 and this will be 1. So you can see that if I start with this initial state, in just one step, I actually reach a steady state. Any number of updates you're going to do, you're essentially going to get the same state, right? So this is what is called as a steady state or a fixed point, okay? Yes. It's just an assumption I've made. Oh yeah, of course, yes, absolutely, absolutely. There's a reason why we did this for this toy example. Okay, so now let's take another case here. Here's another one. So if I start with a 0, 0, 0, start with a 0, 0, 0, 1 will be 1, 0, 1. That will be 0, 1, 0. It will be 1, 0, 1. So now you can see that any number of times you actually update, you're essentially going to keep repeating between these two states. So these two states will start appearing in a cyclic manner, and such a state is called as a cyclic attractor. Suppose if I start with, I've got a 0, 0, 1, okay. In a steady state, any number of times you do, you're going to sit only on that state. Whereas in a cycle, you'll keep switching between them, but it's a fixed number of states. You'll keep cycling between only those fixed number of states. Clear? Okay. So like this, you can also have, suppose if I start with this state here. Suppose I start with 1, 1, 0. I do a few updates. I will essentially end up with another fixed point, which is a 1, 0, 0, okay? So now, once we have these fixed points, I can map them all into another kind of a graph, which is called a state transition graph, okay? So what we are essentially doing is, when you go from one update step, this is 0th update step to first update step, what we are doing is we are essentially doing a transition between one state to another state. Yes, Shamik. Yes, I'll come to that. There's a way to do that. Okay, we're going to see that. There is a very simple trick to do this. Okay, so this is called a state transition. And now what I can do is I can create a state space. The state space is essentially a collection of all the possible states in the network. Okay. So the state space is just a collection of all the states. So here, the network has 3 nodes. So the maximum possible number of states is 2 cube, which is 8. So this one will have only so the dimension of the state space is 8. And now it's a small network. I can essentially draw the entire state space very, very easily, okay? And in fact, the state space is Okay. So what you see here is we have 8 states here, and every arrow is essentially capturing the state transition. Every arrow in the state transition graph is capturing one dynamic step. So which means that the entire dynamics of this network is actually captured in the state transition graph. So once I have the state transition graph, I can just forget about my original network completely. No, the entire dynamics, including the cycle.
Where is the time?
So here,
if I come from the first state to any other state,
correct.
in between I have not, the realistic time is, there is no notion of a realistic time.
Yes.
There is no realistic time update.
Yes. The time sense is only the update steps. Now the entire update is actually captured in this graph here.
Yes, there's no doubt about it.
So when I say the entire Boolean dynamics is actually captured in the state transition graph completely. So once I have this, my entire dynamics of my original network, including the logic associated with it, everything is captured in one graph. And all the properties, dynamics, perturbations, everything can be done using this state transition graph. All perturbations of the network that I do, they are all subsets of this entire state transition graph. Yes. See, the time notion in Boolean, maybe I should touch upon that a little bit. So the time notion in Boolean sense is essentially it's a pseudo time. So every update, so the way you can relate it to a real system is, suppose I have a cell and I start with certain levels of protein in the cell. And now as time progresses, the protein levels are changing, right? So if I now define what is the level which I call as an activated state, okay? So one update step essentially corresponds to that. And now that obviously is changing with time. So every update step I do, I essentially track the cell up to steady state. Is that clear? Yes, so heterogeneity will come later. There is a way to track that, okay? So this clearly does not account for that variation that you're referring to. Yes, it's just a simple time step, okay? So nothing, absolutely nothing, no rates, okay? So
you are saying that any perturbation will lead to any one of these.
yes.
So for example, say I have a PG, a P is knocked out.
Right.
So that is also a perturbation.
Yes.
But then at that point, I have already deleted one of the state that can come in.
Yes.
How I see that? I can't see that.
So, for example, 0, if I have a value of 0, that's as good as that particular protein not present, right? So I can now remove all the possible states which actually carry a value of 1 for the particular gene that you're going to knock out. Remove the entire thing from the network. So that knockout that you're saying is now part of it. Yes. Yes, network and logic, very important. Yes, network and logic. Now, any perturbation you do, it'll become a subset of that. The state transition graph of the perturb, yes?
And it goes both ways?
Yes, it goes both ways. Any perturbation you do here, you can relate it to the original network. And that's not easy. That's not a straightforward relationship. One has to be very careful when you do that. The reverse can be one-to-one, but this side is not straightforward. It's one-to-many, so you have to be very careful about how you interpret that many. Yes.
In the previous example,
Yeah.
that be the same as saying removing the node P and therefore
Yes.
a different network.
Yes.
For which you now have to look at a different state transition.
Right. And that state transition graph will be a subset of this.
So in this case, we've effectively sort of simulated every possible
Correct.
state and then
Correct.
together because it's the number.
Correct.
Other way in which we have much bigger networks. other ways to formally relate the sort of connections in network to whatever steady states it might have without having to simulate?
Not so easy. In fact, we will talk about it in the next part, talk as to how to simulate these things for a larger network. It's not straightforward. Yeah.
But it is a simulation.
Yes, there is a computational tediousness and complexity involved. Yes. You can already see the number of states is like 2 power 3 is a tiny number. And if it's a network of size 2 power 10, you're looking at 1024. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment. So, when you initially started it, I was trying to make connections to Markov chains. But I see a very clear difference. Here, depending on what initial condition you start off from, your steady states can be very different. But from the standard way of thinking of Markov chains, the steady states are independent of the initial condition.
The Markov is coming.
So I see. So there are links.
Yes, that's coming. So this is a deterministic framework. What I have described so far is really in parlance with the classical deterministic framework. And if you have not observed, very important, whichever start state you start with, the fate is already pre-decided. So if here is my fixed point, whatever start state I have, I'm going to land only in that fixed point. So this is a very classical feature of the deterministic approach or deterministic view, where the steady state that you're going to reach is actually pre-decided depending upon the start state. Now this obviously is not a realistic picture, okay? Yes. The entire set to state transition graph. Yes. And see, here it's a graph which actually has different components. Okay, so it has different independent sections, right? That can be a graph. You can have a graph which has independent sections. It's like 2 classrooms, right, in a school, right? So you can have independent sections. These need not necessarily be connected. Okay, but if they are connected, there are some interesting properties that will come out. Okay, any other question? Yes.
So show what step transitions are like. So this will be comprised of, you can have n number of transitions or a phase step in between.
Yes.
From
Yes. So because it's a 3-node network, you don't see that many number of lines here. But yes, if you have a larger network, and I'll show some simulations where you can have very long path in the state transition graph.
we show the start and the end.
Absolutely.
Or we show the
All.
in a state transition.
Yes, all.
If a state transition graph is deeply connected, can you say that there is only one state, or can there be multiple state states?
See, in this simulation that I just showed, where very important feature, which obviously I didn't specifically say for a reason, I am updating all the states simultaneously. So when I do a simultaneous update, this question of weakly connected situation will not arise. It will always be a case where the network will be disconnected if there are multiple steady states. If there's only one steady state, then it will be a connected network. Whether it is strongly connected or weakly connected depends upon the dynamics of the transitions. Any other question? Okay, so I already said that this is a deterministic framework, not very useful in terms of capturing the realistic behavior, but it answers an important question. The fixed point of a network is a property of the original network and the logic. Whether the presence of heterogeneity or deterministic nature, the fixed point is really fixed. So therefore, the fixed point which is actually present of the network can easily be identified by simply doing this kind of a simultaneous update of all nodes. And this simultaneous updating of nodes is what is called as synchronous updating. Should write it here. called the synchronous updating. And to answer your question, Shamik, it's the synchronous updating which is really, really simple to implement. If you just implement the synchronous updating for all the states in the state space, whichever state actually goes and leads to itself because of any one synchronous updating are basically the fixed points of the entire network. So you can identify all the fixed points in one go. Extremely simple to do and very, very trivial exercise. So all you need to identify is the states which have an arrow going to itself. That's it. Once you have that, you have all the fixed points of the network. And the game comes in as to how do you identify the heterogeneity in the dynamics that may be present in the network, which will drop into these fixed points of the network. And that's where the real game comes in. Okay. Any other question? Did I make a mistake? Oh, it should be 000, yeah. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So with this, we move on to the next aspect, which is basically the asynchronous updating. Now, there are multiple types of asynchronous updating approach, and I'm specifically going to describe one generalized method, so which is called as the random order asynchronous. Okay. So the idea here is very simple. So the idea here is that rather than updating all the nodes simultaneously, I update them in a certain random order. And the rule here is for between every time step t and t plus 1, update all nodes in certain random order. So now, depending upon the order in which the updating is done, the transitions could actually be different. Okay, and let's look at how this is different. So if I now take the same 3-node network at time t equal to 0, I start with a 0, state, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to update C first. I'm going to update B first, and next, and then I'm going to update A thereafter. So if I now do this, I'll have a 0, 1. I'll have a 0, 1, and a 0, 1. Now what you suddenly see is, in a deterministic approach, if you had started from a 0, 0, there is no way you will be able to reach the 0, 1 state, which is a fixed point of the network. So this ability to update using a random order sequence allows you to actually open up the dynamics of the network, and this is more close to what you see in a real system. It gives you a much richer dynamics, richer Boolean dynamics as compared to the standard deterministic approach, which also implies that a start state can actually land into multiple fixed points. It allows the possibility of a given start state landing into multiple different fixed points and permitting stochastic behavior, capturing the stochastic nature of the responses. So I can do the same exercise for many other examples, and if I now jot down the permutation. So if I have 3 nodes, I essentially have 3 factorial permutations. So I can now do this updating for every possible permutation that is permitted by the system, right? So I can now list down the permutation and the state that is reached. If I start from a 0, 0, 0 state and I do all possible permutations, let's say permutation 1, okay. These are the 6 possible permutations. And in fact, I encourage you to please do this simulation for all the permutations, and you convince yourself that this is the state that you will get. Okay, so these are the outcomes of the Boolean model, Boolean logic functions implemented with these permutations. So now you can see that from a given start state, you can reach both fixed points, and you can also reach 0, 1, 1 state, which is again here. And if I do one more step, it will again land into the fixed point. Note that this is 6 permutations for only one state transition, okay? So therefore, I can now find out what is the probability of reaching a given state because of a single transition. So therefore, if I now start drawing the state transition graph, we start with this state here, I can end up in 0, 0, 1 with a probability of 2 by 6. I can end up in 1, 0, 0 with a probability of 2 by 6, 1 by 6, and 0, 1, 1 with a probability of 1 by 6. So now what I have essentially captured is the transition probabilities for transitions coming out of this state 0, 0, 0. And I can now do this for all the possible states in the entire network, and that will give me the complete state transition graph pertaining to the asynchronous updating mode for the toy network that we have started with. Yes? Yes. So the fixed points are identical. The cyclic attractors are not. The fixed points that you get in synchronous state transition graph is identical to what you will get in asynchronous updated mode of state transition graph. And in fact, if you observe carefully, the state transition graph you get from a synchronous updating scheme is actually a subset of the state transition graph that you will get for the asynchronous updating mode. So with this, we can actually construct the entire state transition graph of this 8-node network. And now you can see that it's not going to be as simple as this. So I'll try to sketch a small part of the network. Yes. No. It will be exact because the fixed point has nothing to do with the nature of the updating. The fixed point says that, and I start with that particular state, I have to land back into the same state. And now the synchronous updating, whether I use that or whether I use an asynchronous updating, it doesn't really matter. Any other question? Okay. So here's a little snapshot of the state transition graph for the asynchronous update. And this is not a complete state transition graph. This is only again a partial that I've just calculated, but one can actually estimate and put together the entire state transition graph. And this is a fixed point. Okay. And I can calculate the transition probabilities for each of these cases. And now you can see that this actually has a Markovian framework that comes in, because I have transition probabilities for each of the arrows which are present. And very important, state transition graph is always directed graph. It goes only in one direction, okay? So you have a start state, it goes in one direction only, okay? And what is interesting is that, yes. Yeah, please.
So this is related to this question, right? So in this scenario, I see 0, 0, 0 starting state can give rise to 0, 1, 1 has a fixed point, right?
No, this need not be a fixed point. This is only one transition. One transition. I still have to do many more transitions to assess that it's a fixed point. My fortune is that I already know that 1, 0, 0 is a fixed point because I have done synchronous simulations. Yes. Right. So when I use a permutation, right, the order of updating, now I can always have my last permutation as the sequence in which the synchronous permutation, synchronous updating is done, right? I can always have that sequence. Now, when I do the updating, what I do is, if you observe carefully, when I do the updating in the second step, I'm essentially using the states which are arrived by updating the previous step here, right? I'm not using the states at t equal to 0. So the state at t equal to 1 is the final state I get after using all the possible nodes that is present in the network are updated at least once, and exactly once. So therefore, if I see that when I update for B, I'm essentially using the states, values for the states which I have got by updating the previous node in the sequence of the permutation. So because of this constraint, when you use a synchronous, one of these permutations would certainly actually point to a fixed point. And therefore, whether you use a synchronous or an asynchronous, the fixed point is actually fixed. Yes. Absolutely no notion. Yes. See, what matches here is that, see, whenever you reach a fixed point, okay, all permutations will essentially feed to that one, right? So the probability is 1, right? The transition probability is 1. And what is the transition probability here? 1. That's it. That's exactly where it is. The transition probability of all the edges present in the state transition graph in a synchronous update mode is exactly 1. And so you will get it. Any other question? Okay. So once I have this in place, now I'm set for doing assessing all kinds of stochastic behavior of my original network. So I don't need my original network anymore once I have the state transition graph. So I can generate what is called as the state transition matrix. So this is a state transition matrix. I just call it M, which are essentially the transition probabilities between any two nodes in my state transition graph. Okay, so this Mij is the transition probability direction is important from I to J. Okay. So once I have this matrix, my entire dynamics is hidden in this matrix. And this is now directly amenable to the classical Markov chain model processes. All properties, all features of the Markov chain model can be directly applicable to this MIJ. And this is how we can actually capture the stochastic behavior of the network. And what is interesting is the source of the stochasticity is actually hidden in the way we are doing the updating. Now, the source of the stochasticity in the random order asynchronous simulation is essentially the interdependency between different nodes. Because I'm having these random permutations that I'm using, which is uniformly randomly chosen, the interdependency of the interaction between different nodes can actually be different in different cells. And this stochasticity is what is actually captured by this random order asynchronous simulations. Yes? Yes, they are very different. In fact, what you said is what is called as a general asynchronous approach, which I'm not discussing now. Yes, that's also correct. That approach is also possible. But there's a caveat to this. The nature of the source of stochasticity which is involved by doing this exercise is different from the source of stochasticity which is present here. That's the only difference, okay? If you want to use that source of stochasticity for your model, great. That's what you should do. Yes. General asynchronous. I'll write it. General asynchronous, where instead of doing these permutations, at every step you just randomly choose any node and update. Yes. Right. These are the only two stochastic behavior permitting asynchronous simulations. In synchronous, this is one method of doing. Another method of doing is what is called as a delay synchronous, where you don't update all the nodes at all time points. You say, I'm going to update only some nodes at some time step, and I'm going to have some time delay. These are the only two that I know of. See, when it comes to simulations, the randomness that you bring in, the best you can do in simulations is by choosing what is called as uniformly randomly. Okay, this is the best you can do. Now, the idea in these models is to mimic the nature of the randomness which is present in the real system. Okay, now if you know the nature of randomness, then you can incorporate them in your model the way you want. But unfortunately, we don't know. If you see, the typical modeling exercise is to understand what is the source of the randomness which is present in the real system. So you make a hypothesis, and then hopefully you're successful in verifying the hypothesis, and then you know that this is the randomness which is likely to be present in your system, right? Absolutely, almost all exercises like that. Yes. Yeah. So if you see here, this is a permutation sequence, right? For every update step, I'm updating the states in the order of the permutation. Right. So I use the logic and I find out what are the values if I'm going to update only C. Then in the next step, I use the sequence of the Boolean values in the previous update here, and then I update only node B. And the next step, I update only node A. And this entire three together is called one time step update. This is CBA, correct? Oh, did I make a mistake? What did I do? Oh, I made a mistake. Okay. Please check this, okay? Please correct. I'm sure I made some typo somewhere, okay? So you please do the simulation and get these numbers right, okay? Okay, so once I have the state transition probability, then all the stochastic framework are directly applicable to the state transition graph. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at how to estimate the steady state probability of the network to reach different fixed points. Now this steady state probability can actually be directly compared with the experimental observations. So while doing steady state probability, I can also, just a second, I need to estimate what is called as the absorption probability. Yes, please. Yes, that's what is going to be the second talk that I'm going to give, how to approximate it, okay? Because for larger network, clearly you can see that this is a computation killer, okay? So it's just not possible to do this. Okay, so in order to find steady, yes? No. We'll talk about it in the second half, okay? So there are some tricky things there as to what you can sacrifice and what you cannot, okay? So that's slightly more involved, so we'll do it in the second half. Is that okay? Okay, so in order to find the steady state probability, you actually have to get what is called the absorption probabilities. And this is simply defined as the probability of a state to reach a fixed point. This is what is called as an absorption probability. Now clearly it means that if there are multiple fixed points present in the network, then each of these fixed points will have a specific absorption probability for a given state, given start state. And once I enumerate and estimate the absorption probability to reach different fixed points from all the start states in my network, the steady state probability is a simple average, okay? And this steady state probability in real terms, it essentially reflects the ability of a population of cells to actually settle into a given phenotypic response. To attain a specific fixed point is what is reflected by this steady state probability. And the absorption probability is where the heterogeneity can actually be captured. Different cells can be modeled as having different starting conditions or initial conditions, that is different protein levels. And each of these would actually land into a fixed point with a certain probability. So now, because of this observation, you will have a distribution of the probability with which different cells will actually land into a given fixed point. And that is one way to actually compare the heterogeneity which can be observed in experimentation with the heterogeneity captured by the Boolean model. Yes? Cyclic is extremely hard. There is no clean way to do it right now. We're only looking at fixed point right now. Okay, yes. Yes, all the absorption probability, yes. Yes, absolutely correct. Yes, yes, yes. You can have diversity of fixed points, and you can find out what is the probability with which the network will settle down into a given fixed point. That you can find out. For example, you can have two fixed points. The network could settle into a fixed point with a 60-40 ratio. So you can find out that probability. And that is steady state probability. Any other question? Okay, so the way to estimate absorption probability is, yes. Yes.
So suppose you could find out all the steady states, then one minus the absorption probability would be equal to the probability of landing in the cycle.
No. So the cycles, one has to be very careful. I mean, I purposefully did not delve into cycles. So the cycles are actually of two types. One cycle, which are basically, it's meandering among itself with zero connectivity from the cycle to other parts of the network, okay? So that means they themselves would be a strongly connected component. I'm sorry, I'm using graph theory language here for those of you who don't know. Just to respond to this. Now, if it's not a strongly connected component, then you have to identify whether that particular cycle actually has some way by which it can connect to the fixed point. So that's a little hard exercise, and therefore this steady state probability is restricted only to the fixed point, and some of the probabilities of reaching different fixed points will exactly sum to 1. Okay, so the way to calculate the absorption probability is, here's a trick to do this, and I'll also, try to derive the formalism to do it in a very, very elegant manner. Okay? So suppose if this is my start state, suppose I have start state S1, and with one step transition it goes to S2, another transition it goes to S4. Okay? So I can find out the probability of the Markov chain starting at 1 and is in state S4, okay? And this, and in exactly in 2 steps, very important. The number of steps is important. In exactly 2 steps. Now this, if this is the transition probability, 2, 4, this is essentially given by P12 into P24. So this is the probability of Markov chain starting at state S1 and being present in S4 exactly after 2 steps. And now I can have another path from S1 I can have another path from S1 to S4. This is one path. I can have another path from S1 to S4 in exactly 2 steps. And that transition probability P64. So therefore, the net probability of the Markov chain starting in S1 and present in S4 in exactly 2 steps is essentially sum of all of these probabilities. These are independent paths, and we can take a sum of all of these probabilities. Yes. I didn't understand what you mean by simple path. Okay. See, state repeating doesn't arise at all. If state repeats, it's a fixed point. It doesn't go any further, right? It stops. So that question doesn't arise at all. If it is a self loop on S2, there cannot be S2 to S4 because it's a fixed point. Cannot go any further. The dynamics will stop, right? Okay, so essentially these are the elements of the square of the state transition matrix, okay? So if you see the net probability of in exactly 2 steps is essentially sum over all k, pik, pkj, okay? And this is nothing but these are the elements of the square of the state transition matrix. So if you see M, you just take square. So now you can immediately generalize. So you can take any powers of M, and each of these powers of M would essentially tell you what is the probability of reaching that state in those many number of steps. And this is actually a very important graph theory property which we capitalize upon extensively in the Markov chain model. Yes. Yes, please. Repeat again? Yeah. What is policy? This is a basic probability law, right? I didn't understand your question. See, whenever you have a sequential events, you have to multiply the probabilities. And when you have independent events, you have to sum the probabilities, right? That's the basic rule of probability, right? Okay, so once I do this, I'm all set to do this. Yes. You'd have covered the entire graph. Over some multiplication, you'll have covered the entire graph. And right, you'll get the absorption probabilities. Okay, so, and there's a cute way to do this. So it's called the canonical form. So we can convert the state transition matrix into what is called as a canonical form. And that canonical form actually allows you to estimate the absorption probabilities in an extremely simple matrix operation. So you can convert this into a Q matrix. They partition the state transition matrix into these 4 blocks here. And this block, this is essentially the fixed point block, where all fixed points will simply land into itself. So clearly it will be a diagonal having 1s, and all other transition states are to be aligned this way. Now, you see, there is no meaning to associate which state would be S1 and which state would be S2 because the labels are all randomly placed. So therefore, we can convert the state transition matrix and align them into this canonical form. And aligning them to this canonical form, you'll immediately see that multiplying these state transition matrices would actually give you a certain form which is very easy for calculations. Okay. So Q, just in terms of the real sense, Q is the probability of not being absorbed into a fixed point in 1 step. This is the meaning of the probabilities which are actually present in this block Q. And you will see that R is essentially the probabilities which are connecting these states to the fixed point. Okay. So now, after this is just algebra. 315. So now if I do m square, it's essentially q and that will just be q square qr plus r 0 and I. And so if you continue this, you will say m to the power of m will simply be q power m minus 1 r plus r and 0 and I. So now in the Markov chain, if I travel through the state transition graph sufficient number of times, which means I have done sufficient number of updates that I am reaching a steady state, or in state transition graph I'm actually reaching a fixed point, then essentially I'm looking at a case where what will happen when m tends to infinity, okay? And when m tends to infinity, it will essentially boil down to 0 r I. And that's very easy to understand. All values of q are less than 1, so you keep taking powers, eventually it will disappear. The entire matrix will disappear, okay? And so this, does anyone identify what this one is? It's a mathematical identity. Yeah? Anyone? It's not 1 for sure. Identity? It's not identity matrix. So this is, if m goes to infinity, this is I minus q inverse. Okay. So if q is less than 1, because all elements of q are probabilities, strictly less than 1, less than or equal to 1. And in this case, it will strictly be less than 1 because q are the probabilities of the transition states. They are not the probabilities of the fixed point. So all elements of q will be strictly less than 1, and therefore this is essentially I minus q times inverse of I minus q. In fact, it's a good exercise to show this. It's a very simple, it's a 2-line step to show this. So once you get this, the absorption probability so if I realign this as m going to infinity, it will be 0, I minus q inverse I. So the columns of this matrix will give you the absorption probability of reaching the fixed point of interest. So if you have multiple fixed points, multiple columns will give you the absorption probability of the intermediate states to reach that fixed point, which means all the start states in my entire network, I can essentially find out what is the absorption probability to reach a fixed point. And I take an average of that, that gives me what is the steady state probability to reach that fixed point, which means the steady state probability with which the network will settle down into that particular fixed point. So this is a very powerful approach and extremely simple. And in fact, the afternoon talk, I'll show that we have a very large matrix, and these are very well-behaved matrices. A simple biconjugate gradient would actually get you the inverse in like very few iterations. These are all standard transition probabilities, and so they're very well-behaved matrices. The condition numbers are good, so it's very, very easy to simulate them. Okay, any questions so far? Yes. Finding this is the problem. I mean, nobody is going to draw the state transition graph. It's essentially we're going to enumerate and calculate what are the elements of the state transition matrix, which essentially defines the state transition graph. I mean, this is basically the adjacency matrix, the connectivity of the state transition graph with the probabilities associated with each of the connections. Yes, very important. Very important, yeah. You need to know all the fixed points if you want to do it systematically and consistently. Oh, it's very easy to show. So, just solve this, you'll immediately know that I minus q is invertible. You can show that x actually is 0 for this, always. It's very, very easy to show this. It's a good exercise, try it out.
What are the fixed points? That should be just the, so I'm just connecting it. I've not seen it done this way. I'm connecting it to the way we did it earlier, the Markov chain. So if you just take the eigenvalues of this MIJ matrix,
Yes.
then all the eigenvalues that are equal to 1,
Yes.
corresponding eigenvectors should give you the
Yes.
points, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
That's how you get it.
Absolutely. But that's a chicken egg problem because you don't know M yet. Yeah. If it's let's say a 40 node network, the state space is 2 power 40. And then you're looking at 40 factorial permutations. So if you know M, then it's directly amenable to all the standard graph theoretic approaches to, simulate all the properties. But getting this is not easy for large networks. Yes. No, not at all. Not at all. Absolutely, it's the same. The only thing you need is to calculate I minus q inverse. That's all. Nothing else. So this I is just a block. It doesn't matter what are the number of fixed points. If it's 2 fixed points, it'll be a 2 cross 2 or a 10 cross 10, whatever. Any other question before I move on to the slide? 5 minutes. Yes. Yeah. So for a synchronous updating scheme, the basin of attraction is prefixed because we know which state is actually going to land into which fixed point. Whereas for asynchronous, the basin of attraction is actually typically shared, okay? It need not be shared, but usually you should assume that it is shared until you prove that it is not. So which means that there will be states which exclusively go to a given fixed point, and there will be states which are actually shared across the basin of attraction of multiple fixed points. Any other question? Okay. Okay. Size. Oh, of course it's not, because it depends on the network and the logic associated, right? So, no, even there you cannot say, because it depends on the logic. Suppose I change my logic. Yeah. Yes, absolutely yes, because it's predefined. No. Okay, so in the theme of the meeting, I thought I'll also show some simulations on some of the network, which actually is relevant to the theme of the workshop. Okay, so I mean, there's a, see, so far, you see, I really didn't talk about some of the complexities which are posed by biological systems, how you incorporate them in the Boolean modeling. For example, cells are stimulated by, let's say, growth factors. Now, growth factor is not a node in the network. It's basically a stimulation. It's not changing with time. So therefore, you have to assign quality to different nodes in the network, and you have to account for that in the Boolean model. Okay? And that's what I'm going to show as a tiny example before we close in the next 10 minutes. So if I now take this network, so TNF alpha is a cytokine which is actually present in, secreted by many immune cells, and I'll talk about it in the next talk. And this, it's really a top level network. It's a much detailed network, but I'm just showing a top level version. Okay, then we have. Okay, so that's a 7-node network, as you can see. And I think I've captured all the interactions. Okay, now this is an input node. Once we fix that the network is activated by the top level node, there's no dynamics associated with that, okay? So therefore, you can actually tag the nodes as input nodes, and you can fix the state of these input nodes in the simulations, okay? Similarly, one can define what is called as housekeeping nodes. For example, there are proteins which are constitutively present, they don't change with time, and they don't participate in the signaling process, but they may be involved in activating something else. And these are all housekeeping nodes, and you can fix the Boolean values of these upfront in the simulations. And then there are these signaling nodes, which basically have dynamics. These are intracellular nodes which have dynamics that dictate the phenotype or the fixed point that is reached. And then you can have what is called as an output node. So entities in the network can generally be classified into these 4 categories, and the biological information about the entities can actually be used to define how these different nodes are actually going to participate in the Boolean dynamic simulations. For example, BAX has a slightly different behavior, and there's a purpose why I took this network for showing here. So BAX is actually a constitutive protein. When it is present, it actually has a strong inhibitory action from NF-kappa B, and when it is absent, it doesn't do anything. This interaction actually doesn't play any role at all. And now you can see that there is a certain AND logic which is actually involved while incorporating this constraint. This AND logic is not dictated by biochemistry. It's basically to account for the natural constraint that is posed by the biological condition of this particular system. Yes? Yeah, you can incorporate that. You can have multiple AND and OR. I'll show some example here. Yes? Yes. Yes, input nodes don't have, housekeeping also don't have incoming connections. They're only outgoing. The input nodes are like the top layer. So if you want to see real cells, right, the input nodes are something which is coming into the cells. whereas these housekeeping nodes are naturally present in them. So it's just to distinguish between these two. Any other question? Okay, so I'll just quickly. So, I mean, this is a very simple Python code. I mean, I talked to the organizers. They said Python is better. I had MATLAB, not you, one of the. Okay. Yeah, oh, well, I don't know how to program in R. I gave a choice between MATLAB and Python, and one of the organizers said Python is better. I said, okay, fine. So there is a standard network X toolbox, which is actually extremely handy in doing a lot of simulations of networks. It also allows you to use the standard graph theory toolboxes to estimate properties of networks, identify isolated sections of the network. They're all very, very robust and extremely quick. They're very well coded, very well done. All the others are standard toolboxes of Python. Okay, so the first step in doing any of these simulations is actually to generate the state space. So this is where the classical way of doing Boolean simulations actually, it's not done properly because the entire state space is usually not considered. If you look at the standard papers where people have used Boolean models, they don't consider the entire state space, and there's an issue if one doesn't consider the entire state space, because the absorption probability is an average. Probability is an average of the probability to reach the fixed point from all the possible states. So if you don't use the entire state space, then the absorption probability and the steady state probability are not true representation of the probability of the network. So the first step is to generate the entire state space that is actually required for constructing the state transition graph. And that's what is actually defined in that part of the code here. It's a very simple code. I mean, I'm not explaining everything here. Okay, the most important part is to actually define the Boolean rules here. I mean, as you can see, there are 7 nodes here. I'm fixing the input node, and all other nodes are actually changing dynamically. Okay. And I fix my output node. I call NF kappa B as a representation for the survival response, and caspase 3 as a representation for the apoptotic response. Okay. And you can see that the Boolean functions can be in multiple combinations, and it's a complete open field as to what modeling assumption you want to use if there is lack of information on what should be the precise logic. And the third part is basically the steady state probability calculations. And the fourth part I have for defining function is just plotting. Okay, so I'll just quickly run this. Okay. All right, so the way I've coded it is in a general framework where I can input the number of nodes. I'm saying that the first node is my input node, so I'm going to fix that. I'm not going to fix any node at 0. I could do that as well. And the dynamically changing nodes are these 6 nodes, okay? And so that gives me, so this is the null set. So this is the starting point of constructing a state transition graph. This essentially, the green circles are essentially the number of states which are actually present for this 7-node network. And then the next step is I can now introduce one permutation. So if you see here, if I just simulate the Boolean model for one permutation, I can immediately see that there are these arrows which are actually pointing out. And just by doing one permutation, you can immediately find the fixed points. Just one permutation is enough, because for a fixed point, the self loop should happen for any permutation. It should be a self loop. And just one permutation of the entire state space, you'll find all the fixed points in one go. So like that you can do for, and then we can find the steady state probability. And this, by the way, is for synchronous simulation, and also show for asynchronous. So this is the, what did I do? Yeah. And then, so this fraction of probability essentially says what is the basin of attraction. Someone asked me about basin of attraction. So this essentially tells you what fraction of the states would actually land into these fixed points. It's a synchronous simulation. The fate of the state is actually pre-decided. The probability of reaching a fixed point from a given start state is exactly equal to 1, and therefore this fraction tells you what is the fraction of the states which will actually land into that fixed point. Yes, you can do that for synchronous as well, yes. Not I minus q, this is the steady state probability. After you do that, you have to average it out. Okay, so the same thing can be done for synchronous simulation as well. Asynchronous, I'm sorry. It's exactly the same. The only difference is that if you see, the function is defined in a slightly different manner because the order of updating is important here. So here we are actually, here's where the order of updation is actually coded in here. So every time you take a permutation and then you update it in this order, okay? So whatever is the order of the permutation, that variable order essentially has the permutation sequence. Okay, 7. Okay, it's taking a bit. Okay, that's a null set. This is for, that's for one permutation. And this is like the second permutation. I can do a second permutation. And here I have color coded it in a particular way. So the blue ones are essentially the state transition that was obtained by doing the first permutation. And the red ones are essentially the state transition which we got when we did the first permutation, and the same transition was obtained when we did the second permutation. So therefore, the red ones are essentially having two permutations leading to the same state transition, whereas the blue ones have exactly one. Okay. So this one calculates the entire state transition graph. Yeah, so that's the complete state transition graph for this network here. It's a 7-node network, and you can see it's a big web by itself, okay? And then we can calculate the transition probabilities. Okay, so that's the steady state probability of reaching different attractors. And you can see that the numbers are very different from what you got from the synchronous simulation, which immediately says that the basin of attraction is actually shared across these different fixed points. Okay, I think I'll stop here. Already 10 minutes past my time, so I'll stop here and we'll continue in the research talk in half an hour's time, right?